Bob Murphy, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brent. Glad to be here.
Yeah, man, my audience is pretty varied. Some of them are certainly going to know who you are, but for others who may not be familiar with you, could you give me the quick TLDR of who you are and what you do?
Sure. I am an Austrian school economist, libertarian theorist, and author. I spent some time in academia. Most recently, I was at Texas Tech, and I've been in the private financial sector. And right now, I'm the chief economist at Infinio, which is a tech company that's uh, doing putting life insurance on the blockchain, basically. But yeah, in general, I write and speak a lot, and I have a podcast called The Bob Murphy Show on monetary matters primarily.
Got it, got it. Thanks for that. And so, what would if for someone who's not familiar with what an economist does on a day to day basis, how would you describe that work?
Sorry, it froze up there. You said what's an economist do on a day to day basis?
Yeah, yeah. Just give me like a breakdown of what an economist, let's say an Austrian economist, 'cause I think there's different
Sure.
schools out there. Like, give me
Yep.
a feel for what you do on a day to day basis.
Well, it would depend on when you're in academia. Obviously, you're writing articles. Oh, okay, but yeah, I'll tell you like the projects I'm working on right now. So I won't say his name because I don't know if this is public, but I know a guy who's collecting he's collecting essays for a book on advances in Austrian economics, and I'm writing a chapter on uh, capital and interest theory. Okay, and so like specifically Ludwig von Mises, who was one of the big gun Austrians, that's who the Mises Institute is named after. People have heard of that. He had a theory of how commercial banks flood the credit market with money and push interest rates down to artificially low levels, and that causes the boom bust cycle. And so then there's some issues in terms of like how do you operationalize that, and so that's what my essay is going to get into. So it's quoting from different economists and try to come up with advancing the knowledge and to say, okay, what we've been talking about up till now is this, but there's some open problems still in that framework, and here's my proposal as to how do we get through this, to make the theory stronger, that kind of just. There's a lot of that in the Austrian school in terms of like Austrian economists talking to other Austrian economists in the literature. But more generally, a lot of what we do is trying to educate the public on, hey, this is why all these government interventions that are allegedly going to, help poor people or smooth out the business cycle, where actually, no, these government interventions are making things worse, or in many cases, the very problems that we're trying to solve are caused by prior acts of government intervention. So a lot of it, since the Austrians in practice disagree with a lot of what the government and central banks are doing, a lot of what we do is just trying to teach that to the public, because the only reason the government, the central banks get away with it is they've convinced the public that, oh no, this is for your own good.
Yeah, I agree, and that seems to be a durable problem in the libertarian space because I think the lowest hanging fruit or the easiest counter argument is, oh, you're just greedy capitalists, you don't care about poor people. And I think anyone who's even done a cursory review of the Austrian literature and the boom bust cycle theory, like you talk about, the theory of credit and money, understands that central banks actually harm the poor middle class. I think we have kind of like a unique time in history right now coming out of the COVID cycle because I think people saw it in real time and it was so compressed. I think
Mhm.
these cycles oftentimes get really elongated, but this was something in real time. We saw this massive influx of newly created money, and we saw exactly what happened. We saw the people on the lower rungs of society kind of getting kicked off into the gutter, homelessness and drug addiction, inflation, all these things. People saw it in real time, so I think we have an opportunity to educate people. What do you think?
I think you're right. This is definitely, uh, the idea of inflation and its consequences is much more topical now than it has been basically in my career. Um, and because even by official measures, it's the worst it's been in 40 years in the United States. But I want to stress too that so that's definitely what gives us a foothold. But my point is, and this is where I think the Austrians are pretty unique among the various schools of economic thought. It's not like if CPI were only rising at 1% a year, that wouldn't be a problem, right? That if a when I say this, what I'm about to say to you here, Brent, people think it's simplistic, but that's partly why I'm saying this. Like, it's so obvious. If you found out that the guy down the street from you in his basement had a laser printer that made authentic looking $100 bills, and he was cranking those out, and he had all kinds of Ferraris and mansions and stuff, you wouldn't say, well, let's go check the price level and see, has CPI been rising more rapidly than normal to see if this guy's in any sense hurting the rest of us? No, you could just look at all his stuff and say, he's not working for that. He's not contributing. He's clearly just printing money and redistributing it. And even if it's were the case, CPI really, if you look at a chart, you can't really see anything. It's clearly like, okay, well, if he hadn't done that, then CPI would have been lower than it has been. You know what I mean? So if the price inflation was actually only 2.8%, well, then maybe it would have been 2.6 if he didn't run all those $100 bills, right? So it's not that it was costless. It's just saying, it's relative to the counterfactual. So likewise, I run into this, and there were economists, Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok, they're associated with George Mason. They have a podcast called Marginal Revolution. It's, great stuff. I like listening to it. They just had one. That's why I'm saying this, Brent, because it just dropped the other day, where the title was, is the Fed impotent, or does the Fed matter? Something like that. And they were talking about, these guys like Fisher Black and Eugene Fama and such, who were arguing. And, Tyler and Alex were nuanced, but they were basically saying, yeah, there's a lot to be said for this. And again, the title they gave to the episode and what they said in the first minute was, these guys make the argument that the Fed is kind of impotent. And I want to say, okay, well, then give it to me. If the Fed doesn't do anything, I'll take it. I'll create 100, I'll go buy, and because, oh no, you got to buy assets. Okay, give it to me. I will go buy financial assets. I'll just go around the world buying bonds, printing money, metaphorically out of thin air, and I'll earn the spread and so forth. Yeah, I'll do that if it doesn't matter. And so clearly it does matter. And that's why when Ron Paul says end the Fed, everybody loses their minds, right? If it didn't matter, then how come it would be such a nut job idea to end it, right? So that's kind of what I'm saying is the official thing. The economists have done a good job of making it really boring and like, oh yeah, if prices just offset, as long as the public anticipates price inflation, it's not that big a deal, and just put your money in the stock market. And no, just like, again, the guy down the street cranking out $100 bills, if we all knew that and we were investing in real estate, it wouldn't mean he wasn't hurting us. No, the Ferraris and mansions he was buying, that was coming from the community, right? Those are real resources. There's no way around that. So
Yeah, I agree. And Matt, you raise an interesting question in my mind, which is how do you better educate the public? Because it seems to me, and I'm an old dude, I'm almost 50. It seems like the acumen of the average person with respect to macroeconomic matters has really declined. Particularly been disappointing to me on the right, because the right has been historically the people that have been most closely aligned with free markets, and they would understand basic economic things like taxation and government spending are actually negatives and they hurt things. It seems like the new, like the Trump Republicans don't really have a grasp on inflation. I think that they are looking at, like, pointing, like you said, to the CPI and say that is inflation. Well, it's actually, that's not inflation. Inflation is actually increasing the money supply. Increases to the CPI, or producer price indexes or consumer price indexes are a result of that. I don't feel like many people realize that. I don't think many people realize that Trump caused most of this inflation that we saw under Biden. Like that, or we talk about price inflation, right? Any of these indexes going up were actually caused by that money printing under COVID, and that. That disconnect, that lack of education and awareness has been like a durable problem for me, right? When I engage with people online, they just don't seem to see it. Do you see the same thing, or am I just high in the night here?
I largely agree with you. I mean, just in general, like put aside, the specific of Trump, but in general, the punditry class has just gotten dumber and dumber over time. And I think that's partly, I mean, just like, here's an example. When email first was big, like I can remember I would write long, well-structured paragraph emails to like 6 people, and I was making something. And then now you're lucky if I use the shift key and put in capitalization, and I'm just firing stuff off. And so, there is that element. Like blogs used to be real big, at least among economists. But now nobody reads blogs anymore. That's like, no, give it to me in a meme or something, or give it to me in a short clip on Twitter. So there is that element, and you can see it. That, say what you will, but like in the 1980s when I first got politically active in terms of like, reading this stuff and caring. Yeah, I mean, there was guys like William Safire and Pat Buchanan and, William F. Buckley, for all his bad. I mean, he was an erudite guy and would, talk in real wrong locutions and blah, 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 and now it's, compare that to Sean Hannity or something, and it's just like, oh my gosh, So yes, there is that general degradation, and right, like if you go look at the Nixon Kennedy debate, presidential debate, that was a lot more highbrow than Trump versus Hillary Clinton or whoever. So there is that general shift. But then you're right, more specifically to what you were saying. I have noticed that, yes, among the right wing conservatives, I mean, right now there's a huge thing with all of Trump's emphasis on tariffs. There's a huge thing to,
Mhm.
overthrow a lot of the core of, free market economics, and just say, oh yeah, don't listen to those crazy economists with their whole free trade shibboleth, and tariffs are awesome, and that's how we, promote U.S. strength and whatever. And they're not even. Some of them are more nuanced and saying, oh yeah, tariffs are taxes; those are bad, but it's better than an income tax, so we're going to phase it. Okay, fine. But a lot of them are just flat out saying, no, tariffs are great. That keeps jobs at home. Or these are fallacies that were blown up 200 years ago. And so it is disturbing to see that coming back in. And you're right, on monetary policy, especially, like Trump is, he's good on some things, but on others, like he's, I think he even said, like, I'm a low interest rate kind of guy or something
Mhm.
like that. So there is that element as well.
Yeah, I definitely see that. So I'm glad you see the same thing as well. And I try to talk to these people, and have a difficult time. And I don't know what's going on with the political discourse. I know, in the libertarian community, this is a very weird year for me. And I think there's people that I didn't expect backing Trump. Like, I think, did you back Trump? I can't remember. I know Tom did. Tom Woods.
I mean, with normally I'm always very slippery with things like that. So no, I'm anti Trump, meaning whenever people launch ridiculous complaints about Trump, I would defend him. I wrote in Jesus of Nazareth on my ballot. I live in Massachusetts, so it didn't matter what I was going to do, and
Fair
so that's
enough.
what I happened to do.
Fair enough. I've seen it.
Let me just say, I was very much glad that Trump won over Kamala Harris. So for sure, I made no bones about that. Let me answer you this way, Brent. There was a trend going around on Twitter/X, where people were asking Grok, use my post and draw a picture of me or something like that, and that was going around like 2 weeks ago. So I asked it, and it showed someone sitting in a desk in a suit, and the blackboard behind it said economist Robert P. Murphy, and it was a picture. It was a drawing of Trump. Like, so it said, oh, based on your feed, we think you're Donald Trump. So I realized, like, oh, maybe I am being a bit too nuanced in my anti-Trump, that Grok thinks I'm basically pro-Trump. So I can answer you that way.
No, that's fair enough. It's just been really weird for me to watch, and I don't know exactly what's going on. Seeing like Dave Smith and Angela McArdle, the
Mhm.
LP drama, you're probably aware of all that stuff. Um, it's just very weird for me to see. I don't know what to make of this election cycle, but I will say I'm happy that they're bringing in Ron Paul in some advisory capacity to DOGE. I think that might have the most impact of anything, right? Regardless of what happens on the policy front in Congress or what the president would push for initiatives. Like even just a public awareness campaign of the more ridiculous aspects of government spending might actually do the most good. So I'm kind of hopeful for it, but I guess I was burned pretty deeply by the first Trump term. So I guess you could pencil me as a pretty hardcore skeptic as far as him changing his colors, at this stage.
So there are definitely a lot of people in Trump's either inner or 1 degree removed circles that are very good, and again, with all this stuff, you can end up, wanting perfection and being like, oh, well, no, this guy said this. And I get it. But I mean, just relative to how things normally are, like even like George W. Bush, people might think, oh yeah, he was bad on foreign policy. Well, right. He was also bad on housing. He was a bunch of the, ethanol mandates and all that crap came in under the George W. Bush. You think, oh, he's an oil man from Texas. No, a lot of that stuff came in under his administration. It wasn't that it was all from Obama, so just in general, it's all a big farce. And then Trump, yeah, he was bad on several things, but he was where he was good. It was like crazy, like pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords and stuff. I mean, that was inconceivable that a president would do that. And he just did it. You know what I mean? And I guess it was partly because he had done some things that any other candidate would have been torpedoed over. And he just said, no, you can call me a white supremacist. I don't care. You can say I'm a misogynist. I'm going to, you got those videos. I don't care. And he just wasn't apologizing. And it kind of like the normal attacks bounced off him. So I think that's what gave him the ability to do other stuff that was, quote, inconceivable. And so, for just example, to give you specifics, so it's not just like, yeah, Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon being in charge of that DOGE and then them being friendly with Ron Paul and such, but like even Howard Lutnick, who, he's very pro tariff, and I don't like that. I think he's dead wrong. But, I can listen to him on a podcast for an hour, and he says a lot of really interesting stuff. Again, whether that's going to happen or not, but, just talking about all, we got all these federal assets and we could just put them to work. And if we can just earn these things, and if, they can cut $2 trillion over here and we can, balance the budget, and it sounds plausible, right? I mean, it's not just he's saying, oh yeah, we're going to cut 4 and 8 and balance it. No, he's like going through the numbers and saying this is what we'll do. And it's things that, other political figures wouldn't have done, but there's all these guys that, are coming from big money in the private sector and know how to run a company and stuff. And so there is that element that, it's last thing I'll say here, but it's a mistake to think, oh, just run the government like a business. Like that doesn't really work for various reasons. I don't know if you want to get into that, but still it's a lot better to have a bunch of business people coming in and trying to cut spending and have efficiencies and realizing, well, this is just crazy. Why don't we do this? And we'll save, $200 billion a year, rather than like lifelong politicians or people who've just their whole adult career has been as a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C.
So I'm not a quant, right? So I'm not a math nerd. Does the math there? Because I've honestly, for a long time, been in this sort of mindset that we're basically in a soft default now. Like we're defaulting through inflation, and eventually there's going to be a currency crisis. And I don't see how it's avoidable when you have so little of the federal budget, which is tied to discretionary spending, right? You have all this sort of mandatory spending and a baseline budgeting. It just goes up year over year. Can you paint me a picture where this works out? Because I'm not very hopeful for it.
Right. So I think, again, I don't remember the numbers. So let me just say this. Listening to Howard Lutnick, and the only reason that's fresh in my mind is I was just doing it like literally yesterday. Somebody sent me, said, hey, this is really good. You got to check this out. And again, he's in the beginning, he was lauding tariffs and how great they were. And I'm against that. I think that, he's committing an economic fallacy there. But having said that, if they really did say we're going to ramp up tariffs and then any incoming revenue from that we're going to use to offset income taxes, well, then that, I could see that. And the host flat out asked him, because he said, hey, Trump on Joe Rogan's podcast floated the idea of just replacing them. Is that possible? And Lutnick, to his credit, was like, no. I mean, like not with anything in the realm of what the structure currently is, which was, I think the correct answer. So to answer your question, it's everything he was saying in that hour-long discussion that I listened to made sense. He wasn't just throwing out crazy ideas and the math didn't work. And he was, and he wasn't merely saying things that like, oh yeah, well, like I said, the punching bag's always 4 and 8, and that's a drop in the bucket. And he wasn't saying stuff like that. Like he was acknowledging that, yes, we can do this and this, but then, at some point it is going to get dicey. But he was also stressing the opposite side of, there are just hundreds of billion, trillions, arguably, of resources the federal government is sitting on not doing anything with, including like oil and gas deposits that right now are, on federal lands or they're offshore, like Anwar and stuff like that. And just, they're not doing anything with it for, ostensibly for environmental reasons, but you could argue it's, because whatever, the New World Order's taken over, whatever you want to go. But clearly, prima facie, it's kind of crazy that the U.S. is involved in wars in the Middle East, arguably partly because of oil, when we've got more oil than Saudi Arabia is sitting at home and we're not using it. And so anyway, so he was just saying a lot of stuff like that, to answer your question, Brent, it's not just a matter of, oh, we'll just slow the rate of spending growth. And then he was talking about real stuff. And a lot of it was ways the government could bring in more revenue, which I think is a way to get ahead of. And he wasn't saying, oh, we're going to pay off the debt in 2 years. He wasn't saying crazy stuff that Trump said in the first campaign. What he was saying was very aggressive, but it was not impossible. And if he was just some guy doing a white paper for the Heritage Foundation, you'd say, well, this isn't real. But no, this is, Trump's guy, and, Elon's famous, and so they could get enough people behind it. And you've seen like Malay. And so, there's the public, the world is arguably going into World War III already. So certain things that in normal times would have been politically impossible, I think people are open to right now.
Well, I'm hopeful, man. But when I look back, I started doing some quick calculations because I was looking at the federal debt, and what are you, like 34 trillion right now?
Something like
And I
that,
was,
yeah.
and I realized like when George Bush left off, so when Barack Obama took over, I think we had like what 6.5 trillion in debt.
That sounds right. I don't know off the
It's
top of my
it's
head, but yeah.
I think I looked it up and my jaw almost dropped open. I'm like, "Are you kidding me? 6.5 and now we're at 34." This seems like the curve is exponential now. We got a logarithmic curve going on, and I'm looking for some sort of light at the end of the tunnel here that doesn't end in complete disaster for the United States. I mean, do you really honestly see something, or are you just sort of like, maybe a, Hail Mary type situation? We can pull something out, or I mean, what's your like probabilistic analysis on this completely going to a currency crisis?
So a while ago, went all in on publicly supporting Texas secession because at that point I thought this is really the only, sending the right people to Washington and turning this ship right. It's far too gone. And that for me, the only way of maintaining the flame of liberty in my lifetime was to like consolidate forces and have Texas break away and all the freedom lovers who can move there. And, we can kind of, you know, pull back and do a strategic retreat, that kind of deal. And yeah, let the US empire collapse. And hopefully the people in Texas can kind of get away from that and put up a firewall, financially speaking, and get into gold and silver and Bitcoin and whatever, and try to shield themselves from getting sucked down into that. So that's what I thought a few years ago. Now there's many respects in which the situation is objectively worse. Like I said, I think we're later on looking back, people are going to say World War III has already started at this point. Um, and yes, the stuff they have done has only made the dollar crisis that I think is looming even worse. But on the other hand, it is amazing. Like Robert F. Kennedy, head of the HHS, whether he's going to get confirmed, that would have been nutty a few years ago for someone to say that's going to happen. So I'm just saying things that were impossible. Put it to you this way: if they really did let Ron Paul give them a bunch of advice and they took 80% of it, they could turn it around. Like there would still be a crash, to be clear. In other words, I think they've blown up a big bubble, and according to standard Austrian theory, there has to be a crash. But it doesn't mean it would be a 10-year depression. It just means it would be an awful 9 months. You'd hit rock bottom, and then if they had good policies in place, people would grow out of that, and then it would be sustainable from that point forward. So they could do it, and you're right. When I say do it, like it might involve things like what do we do with Social Security? It's it's underfunded by trillions of dollars in present value terms, using actuarial techniques that you would use to evaluate like a pension fund or something for a company. But I think, and I've written on this, you could do things like approach somebody like a wealthy person, a high income earner who's like that's 45, and just say, hey, or let's say 55, that makes it easier. And just say, hey, if you agree to forfeit all your claimed, benefits, you don't have to for the remaining 10 years or whatever it is, you don't have to pay any more Social Security. And I think a lot of people, even though like present discounted value terms, they would be losing money by that, I think they would just take it in a heartbeat because they're thinking, yeah, I'm not going to get that anywhere. Or they're going to claw it back or whatever. You know what I mean? So I think there's lots of ways that they could allow, to reduce the formal, what's the present discounted value of all the unfunded liabilities. I think there's ways they could reduce it that wouldn't be so painful, that would just kind of be acknowledging what a lot of people are already building into their forecasts anyway. And so I think there's ways you could do it. And again, there's a lot of resources. Put it this way: the federal government and the Fed have lots of policies in place right now that are reducing the productivity of Americans and real assets in the jurisdiction of the United States. So if you got rid of some of those, that would make humanity, a lot richer. And then that would help us bear the burden of acknowledging and recognizing all of these, liabilities that are sitting there hanging over our heads.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. The question I always have is how you pitch that case. I think Americans don't like anything that involves pain. if there's responsibility and some short-term pain attached to a long-term better outcome, it feels like we just don't want it, or at least the politicians can steer the constituents to shriek about it and sort of interrupt any attempts at some sort of sanity. So I don't know exactly how you sort of get over that PR hump. Do you have any ideas around that?
Well, I guess all I can say is because they got a taste of it with the price inflation, 2021, 2022, I think that might give some more credibility to politicians who really do come off as authentically, the adults in the room and are saying, guys, it's just going to get worse. We got to deal with this now. Let's some pain now is going to spare us agony 10 years from now. So, you know what I mean? And they might be more willing to do that because they're going to realize like, oh yeah, when the experts, the smartest guys in the room don't have things under control. You know what I mean? Like they were talking, oh, it's transitory inflation, don't worry. And then people are, what the heck? And then I think that's partly why Trump won is we just went through 3 years of leftist academic economists telling everybody that, oh, you know who the big winners are from this inflation? It's the working class. That, if you look at charts here, that real wages of the bottom quartile have risen the fastest. And so they're actually the ones really benefiting from the Biden economy. And it's those fat cats on Wall Street who are, and everyone's like, what are you, out of your mind? So anyway, I think, people having seen that and they know, yeah, things are not good right now, and that someone come along again who has credibility, and that that's got to be important to say, yeah, this isn't just a giveaway that we're just looting the public treasury from my rich buddies, but if it really could be sold properly as this is going to help people, then there's at least a shot of it. And again, what makes me think maybe it's possible, I mean, Milley, just to make sure your listeners know, it's not just that he's kind of a free man. He's a self-described anarcho-capitalist. He referred to my book Chaos Theory in an interview, which is talking about how you privatize the police and like nuclear missiles. Like that's kind of hardcore stuff. And I was like, what the heck? Someone sent me that clip. So anyway, it's then that he was able to win. So it's when the conditions are right. Yeah, the public is, like you call a Hail Mary pass or whatever, but we certainly are down, and we're late in the fourth quarter. So if you're going to do a Hail Mary pass, it's time.
Boy, I sure hope so. And for those who aren't aware, Javier Milei is the president of Argentina. There's some folks who might not know who that is. I know you and I certainly do. I would love to see that type of approach, the chainsaw approach, taken to government here. And that's one of the benefits I think Argentina has, is the executive has quite a bit more power than the United States. So would love to see it. I think the public friction is one aspect of this, but you know what I think is another one, Bob, is Trump himself. I don't think he has the appetite for any sort of negative press about his economy, even if it's short term, and that scares me a little bit. I think there's that tendency towards ego and like, this is the greatest ever, my economy is the best ever, look at what I'm doing. I don't think everybody wants to preside over the bubble. Nobody wants to preside over the recession or the crash, which is actually the cure, right?
Yes, on all counts, I agree with all that. I suppose one possible silver lining to that is, it may have been on your radar, but they asked Jay Powell, the current head of the Fed, would you if Trump asked you to, would you resign? And he said no. And I don't know if somebody asked him or he just volunteered and said, in my reading of the relevant statute, I don't think he has the power to fire me either. Right. And so that was interesting. And so there is a school of thought that says they were trying. I think this is definitely plausible. I don't know enough to like go out and say, I think this is what happened, but I certainly am open to this. And this will answer your question, Brent, that there was a school of thought saying, look, they threw everything they could at Trump, including multiple assassination attempts. It didn't work. And so then their fallback, when I say they, you can fill in the blanks, whatever you think it is, but like the deep state call it, that they realized, okay, we can't stop him. And then they were going to cheat, but he just won so much that they couldn't. So like, okay, fine, let him win. And now let's just get the wheels in motion so that by the time he's actually sworn in, we're in a hot war with Russia. The Middle East is in flames. And then the Fed can jack up rates. In other words, for people who think they have somehow been keeping this economy afloat through smoke and mirrors, and we've been due for a crash for a while now, that they're just going to let that happen right when he comes into office. And everyone's going to say, look at Hitler, and they're going to have like mass protests at his inauguration. He's going to call up the National Guard and go, see, he's Hitler, just like we told you. So there is a school of thought, again, you get the spirit of that, and I think there is a lot of truth to that. And so, if that's the case, I guess you could say, well, maybe Trump's not going to have the option. Maybe they are going to just, the Fed's going to be tight and whatever other tricks they have that they were trying to get the Biden economy to limp along to get him reelected, or then Kamala, that they're just going to let the rug come out and the bottom fall out, and you're going to get the crash. And if he's got guys like Vivek and Ron Paul and whatever advising him, they're going to say, you can't do anything about this. No, just printing more money is not going to fix anything. Let it happen. People will go, if you can just have the unemployment rate start coming down within 7 months, all will be forgiven. And let's just give them, the last 3 years of your second term are going to be great. And here's what we're going to do, and maybe they could convince them.
Interesting theory. So I want to give a little more foundational support for some of my listeners who aren't as wonky. So explain to me the problem with the Federal Reserve, and controlling interest rates and the money supply and that sort of. Why is that an issue? Why is that a problem?
Okay, sure. So it just kind of goes back to when you were asking me what does an Austrian economist do, and I mentioned that book chapter I'm working on. So in a nutshell, the theory first developed by Ludwig von Mises and then his disciple Friedrich Hayek elaborated. Hayek won the Nobel Prize in 1974 for this work. The theory of why in a market economy do we have these cycles where there's a boom period of really, a lot of prosperity, and then there's a crash? Like, how come it's not just steady growth? Why is it that the unemployment rate zooms way up and then it comes way down? How come it's not just more, uniform? And so Mises' theory was to say, okay, in general, market prices help coordinate economic activity. Like, outright socialism, central planning doesn't work. You need market prices to guide people. Nobody is smart enough to be in charge, or even some committee. It's like it's distributed, it's dispersed information, that sort of thing. And market prices help coordinate. And in particular, interest rates, the job they perform is they kind of show you the trade-off between like income now versus income down the road, or like a dollar available for consumption today versus 10 years from now. And if I'm patient and I can postpone gratification, what premium do I get down the road, right? So that's kind of what the interest rate is. And so you want that to be correct, because then that helps society balance, growth over time. And so if the central bank comes in and pushes interest rates down to artificially low levels, and how do they do that? They just create a bunch of money and flood the system with it. Then, among other things, it's not merely that causes prices to rise, which is what the obvious, downside to that would be. If they just print a bunch of money and dump it in the system, everything gets expensive. But no, the more subtle problem that Mises talked about was, he said that makes interest rates wrong, and it gives the wrong signal to the entrepreneurs. And so they start a bunch of long-term investment projects that there's not enough adequate real savings to bring to completion, right? So it's like the producers think they have more capital than they really do, okay? And so then that can cause a short-term period of prosperity, but it's unsustainable, and eventually there's going to be a big crash, right? So that's kind of the idea. And so applying that general theory to our recent history in the U.S., I think that what the Fed did when COVID first hit is that, they had even more than the QE rounds they did after the 2008 crisis, just had an unprecedented amount of infusion of money, and interest rates, going back down to zero and so on, pumped up the stock market and so forth. And I just think that was like, people use the analogy of like a sugar high or something, that gave the appearance of prosperity, but it was an illusion. It was built on quicksand. And then now that the Fed jacked rates up pretty aggressively, normally you would have expected there to be a recession. And there were lots of people warning about a recession. Standard indicators like an inverted yield curve have been flashing red for a while, and it hasn't come yet. And so that, leads some people to call us Chicken Littles, but I still think it's coming. To me, I think it's something like they pumped in so much that we're coasting longer than we normally do, something like that, to, speaking loosely. But that's, anyways, is that answering your question in terms of like explaining the basic framework?
It does. So now I have a practical question, because I've really wanted to ask you this for a while, is what the hell happened from like 2008 until now? Because I'm an old dude. I've been watching the business cycle, and it has a certain number of years in general that these bubbles can be maintained for before they pop. And it seems like we've been in a unibubble. Interest rates have been damn near zero since the end of the '08 financial crisis. And that seems to be pretty unprecedented. There's massive influx of money printing, artificially low interest rates, this, stock market's going crazy in nominal terms. And it seems like there hasn't been a reckoning so far. And I'm wondering, like, what the hell?
Right. So they actually did back off. So, after the '08 crisis, again, the Fed started sharply cutting rates. They hit zero, or like, between 0 and 25 basis points or something was the official, range they gave. I think in December of 2008, and then held them there for exactly 7 years. So like for people who are biblical, like it was kind of like the 7 years of, plenty, and then, that kind of thing. And then they started raising them again. And under Yellen, they did start the so-called, it might even happen under Bernanke, like right when he was leaving office. I can't remember, but they had the so-called taper, where
Taper
they had
tantrum, right?
the rounds of QE, and then they didn't just turn the faucet off immediately. They slowed it down, right? So a combination of mortgage-backed securities and treasuries the Fed had been steadily buying, and then they slowly, turned the faucet off. And then there was a long period where the Fed's balance sheet was constant, and then they actually started letting it shrink. I think maybe Powell was in office at this point, or his tenure, whatever you call it, at this point. And then COVID hit, and then everything went out the window, and they brought interest rates back down to 0, and the Fed just pumped in even more money than they had relative to the QE stuff. So to answer your question, I think had COVID not intervened, and by the way, the yield curve did invert. So I, based on the earlier inversion of the yield curve, had been predicting a bad recession in 2020. So then COVID happened, and we had like officially, the unemployment rate for a period was like 20% or something crazy, And so people were like, oh, you just got lucky. But I was saying, well, I shouldn't be punished, right? Like what I said did come true. It's just you're saying, well, it's only because we don't know, right? We need another counterfactual, universe where COVID didn't hit and they just let nature run its course. And I think there still would have been a bad recession. So to answer, that's kind of what happened. And so I think COVID kind of screwed things up that normally, in other words, had it not been for COVID and the lockdowns and all that, and then what the Fed did, I think it would have been more, they did actually start tightening. They were raising rates, letting the Fed's balance sheet shrink. The yield curve did invert, and I think there would have just been a pretty bad recession, and then everyone would have said, oh, yeah, that's what QE did, and it would have hit around 2020, and so we wouldn't have had this long period. It's just COVID hit, and actually that was an awful economy in a sense, right? It's just we don't think of it as a recession. We think of it as, oh, yeah, that was the lockdown. So that's kind of how I would answer you.
Yeah, cool. That totally makes sense to me. One of the things as you were talking through that, I realized it's very difficult for even somebody who's fairly sophisticated as a layperson with respect to economics to get a beat on what's happening in the economy. Like the CPI, for example, people oftentimes think it's one thing. Like the CPI is today what it was, 20, 30 years ago. And like the government uses hedonics to sort of tweak the CPI to make it look like it's a less inflationary environment. And it plays games with like the labor statistics, BLS. Here's our jobs report, and then it's going to get revised down the road. And I think a lot of people they just read the headlines and they don't understand a lot of this trickery that's going on. So they have a lack of understanding of what the actual economy is.
Right. So yeah, just to talk. So the one I can do more quickly is with the unemployment stuff. You're right. It was during the Biden years, people kept talking about, look at how great the unemployment rate is. And, why are these right wingers on Fox News and whatever, just saying how bad things are. And it was misleading because if you looked at something like the percentage, I forget what the name of the term is now, it's escaping me, but like the percentage of the civilian population that is employed, right? It's related to what's called the labor force participation rate. But if you just looked at it and said, okay, of all the people who are 16 to and above or up to age 64 or something, depending you slice it, and what percentage of them are working, then, that percentage was way down relative to like 2005. And so you say, well, why? What's going on there? And so part of it was, especially after the financial crisis of 2008, a lot of people just dropped out of the labor force. They just stopped trying to get a job. So if you're not actively seeking work, you're not counted as part of the unemployed. Right. And that's not Orwellian in and of itself, right? Like if your parents are retired, they're not working, but they're not part of the unemployment. They don't contribute to the unemployment rate, right? So there is that element, but still, if the reason you're not working is just because you think there's no point, the economy's terrible. That's different than, oh yeah, I'm 75 and I'm, retired and I'm golfing every day. That's
Right.
different reasons to not be seeking work. So there's that element. And then, yeah, as you say with the CPI, again, in and of itself, it's not Orwellian that computers weren't part of CPI back in 1950, right? And yet clearly now, like, the price of a personal computer arguably should, that's kind of an important thing. So there's stuff like that, or even on the face of it, the price of a car right now, either a new car that somebody might buy, is much higher than the price of a new car in 1965. But today's car is a lot better than the 1965 car, right? So it would be, wrong to just merely look at the change in the price and say that, look at how much in price inflation, you know what I mean? So it's not that it's nutty what they're doing, but it does give them a lot of wiggle room. And you can kind of say, what do we know our bosses want the answer to be? And let's figure out, what do we have to, my joke is, as an economist, I can give you any answer you want and I won't be lying. And what I mean is, there's so many things going on in the economy. You can just choose, well, I'm going to keep these 9 things, make these assumptions. And it's not that that's demonstrably insane. It's just that, well, if you're always picking your assumptions to always make it the Democrats are right, that's the thing that Paul Krugman would do a lot, that I talked about on my podcast with Tom Woods, is that, he, on any given argument, if you just looked at that one column he wrote, it wouldn't be so bad. But when you'd say, wait a minute, but when it's a Republican, you analyze it this way. And once you know what I mean? And so
Yep.
it's the inconsistency that way, where he kind of knows what the answer is going to be and he figures out the argument he's going to use.
Got it. Got it. So let's talk about money for a second. I know that Austrians have a very particular definition of money that doesn't exactly square with the dollars that we are pushing around the economy today. Could you go into that a little bit and explain what money is from an Austrian perspective?
Okay, sure. So the definition of money, like the theoretical definition, is it's a commonly accepted medium of exchange. And, medium of exchange meaning something that you accept in a trade, not because you're going to consume it or even use it in production, but just because you're going to trade it away in the future. So, like, that's what a medium of exchange. And then if there's a thing that is that for lots of people in a community, such that on any given trade, this thing is typically on one side of the trade, then that's what we mean by money. All right. So that's, a pretty standard definition. Where the Austrians, I'm not sure if this is what you're getting at, Brent, but where they differ is, so they typically tend to be very, you might say, fans of hard money and commodity money in particular. So they think that if it weren't for government intervention, that, humanity would have used gold and silver coins, and you could do things like have bars and vaults, and, you could have electronic bank deposits and stuff once that technology was invented. But ultimately, the money unit would be something that the market would produce. That's not a function that delegate to the government, just like they wouldn't want the government in charge of the news or, even building roads, stuff like that. So Austrians, their analysis tends to be very free market oriented in that respect. And so likewise, yeah, with money, there's no reason that should be a function of the state to produce. And they think that would be good. Another thing, within the Austrian camp, there's especially the followers of Murray Rothbard were big on what's called 100% reserve banking. And so there they would say another problem with our modern financial system is, for various, regulatory and legal reasons, the banks can, at any given time, the public thinks they have more in their checking account than the bank actually has in the vault or on reserve. And that's why bank runs are possible. And according to the Rothbardian subset of the Austrians, they typically think that that's wrong, and that you could have a more sound banking system based on 100% reserve banking for what's called demand deposits. So banks could still be credit intermediaries. Like, if you had $1,000 you didn't know what to do with, you could buy a CD from a bank and they could lend it out to somebody else. But the idea is you wouldn't think that was in your checking account. You couldn't go to the store and swipe your card and spend some of that 1,000. Like, no, you lent it to the bank. It's not yours anymore. Whereas with checking accounts, it's like the money is doing two things at the same time.
Mhm.
You think it's, oh yeah, my money's in the bank and I can go spend it at the store if I want to. And yet the bank has lent that out to somebody else in a mortgage. And so that's, that mismatch is what, again, not all Austrians, but some think is partly, and that goes into the back to the business cycle thing, that's another way the commercial banks also inflate the quantity of money and that makes interest rates artificially low. So that for those economists in the Austrian tradition, they think the business cycle is not just the central bank's fault, but banks that engage in fractional reserve banking.
Yeah, that's the term I was looking for. Fractional reserve banking, where they actually just, hey, here's the deposit, and I'm going to lend it out a bunch of times to different people and make money off of that lending activity. So, cool. That makes sense to me. And the sound or the hard money thing makes a lot of sense. I think most Americans don't even know that the United States used to be on a bimetallic standard. That Congress's entire
Right.
job.
I would encourage people. Yeah, I wrote on this. My booklet is called Understanding Money Mechanics. So if you just Google Robert Murphy Understanding Money Mechanics, you'll find the free PDF. And yeah, I think it's chapter 2 of that, of particular interest to Americans, as I go through the history. And I want to be clear, there was a period. It wasn't just that the U.S. dollar, like as a paper note, was backed up by gold. No, it was originally from the time the Constitution was formed through the eve of the Civil War. The money was, the government just defined dollars in terms of either a certain weight of gold or silver, and the public determined the quote money supply, right? Like if you just had silver, you could bring it to the mint and they would stamp it into like, $1 coins or quarter dollars, which could be called just quarters. Like that's what a quarter was, it's 25% of a dollar. And then like a $10 gold eagle or a $20 double eagle, and so it'd be a coin that was made of actual gold that was legal tender. There weren't legal tender dollar bills before the Civil War. And again, the public in a sense determined the supply of dollars by them just deciding how much of the raw gold or silver do we want turned into official US coinage. So that system was way different from our current one, but of course. And yes, it was like they were defining the dollar in terms of gold and silver the way they might just say a foot is defined as 12 inches, right? So in terms of just providing certainty in legal contracts and such, it wasn't that they were going to change the size of a foot to promote commerce or so, you know what I mean? Like it's the way now people think of monetary policy. That's not what they were doing. So anyway, that's what it was back then. And which is why people really thought of the money. No, it's gold. Like it's got to be something real, physical, tangible. And now I think partly the change in that, like with the QE and all that, like people don't think money's real anymore.
Which leads me to my next question. How would you, as an Austrian economist, look at something like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies?
Okay,
Seems to be some division in that camp, right? There seems to be opposition there.
Right. So there, I've codified all this with a co-author, Silas Barta, Understanding Bitcoin.us, I think is the website where we have a free, PDF guide. But yeah, quickly. So yes, in the Austrian camp, and especially in the early days when Bitcoin first came out, and you'll still see this, guys like Peter Schiff still just argue, nope, Bitcoin, it's intrinsically useless. Its fundamental value is zero, and it's just been in a bubble since it was born, and it's going to zero. And you're crazy. This is just a hype. Okay. So where they're coming from, yes, is that in the Austrian tradition, Mises developed, his theories of money, and he said, among other things, that in order for people to accept something as a medium of exchange, because remember, that's one of the necessary conditions to be a money, you have to have some idea of what its purchasing power is. Someone's going to trade something to you and you're thinking of, and you're accepting it because you're going to trade it away. When you're looking ahead in the future and saying, oh, wait, I might trade this away, you have to know, what am I going to get for it? And so because of that, Mises said all media of exchange, media being the plural of medium, they have to have first had a history as just a regular commodity so people would know what the exchange ratios were. And then maybe something could qualify and, be a rise above the ranks and become a medium of exchange that then generally accepted, and that could be the money. So given that Austrian framework, which clearly I think was true historically, when Mises wrote that in the early 1900s, then when Bitcoin comes along, there were a lot of Misesians, fans of Mises, saying, well, no, Bitcoin, it's not like it was being used for sandwiches and now we're going to have it do double duty as a means of payment. No, it came on the scene designed just to be a means of payment, a store of value, a unit of account, a money. And since we don't have any history of how do we know what it's worth, and so therefore it can't work. The problem with that is, if that were going to be a roadblock, Bitcoin never could have gotten off the ground, right? So in other words, right now, if you say what can Bitcoin buy tomorrow in the marketplace, I have a pretty good idea. There's some variability, but I have an idea like what Bitcoin can fetch in the market because I can just look at the history of the prices. And so, Mises' argument, if it were going to be a roadblock to Bitcoin taking off, it would have happened in the beginning when someone went to trade it for a bunch of pizzas, and the guys with the pizzas would have said, "Well, no, why would I take that? I have no idea what this thing's going to fetch. I don't want it." And there's nobody ever could have gotten rid of those first Bitcoins, but yet that isn't what happened, right? So, anyway, that's kind of my take on it. That I'm explaining why it is that a lot of Austrians, particularly in the beginning, thought Bitcoin doesn't make sense as a money. It's not a tangible commodity. But at this point, I think it's kind of like, well, that horse has left the barn, or whatever metaphor you want to use.
Yeah, and sometimes it's referred to as digital gold, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that I don't know if that's really resonates with me, but I get what they're saying. I think a lot of people are not transacting in Bitcoin right now, not BTC. I think BCH, yes, I think people are actually using it as it was intended, as peer to peer cash, which maybe is another thing we can go into, is the block size wars. But do you see it that way, like BTC being more of like a store of value and sort of a speculative type asset, or do you view it differently?
Well, it's ironic. So on the Bob Murphy Show, my own podcast, I recently had Steve Patterson on, and he helped Roger Ver write his book Hijacking Bitcoin. So there, among other things, they make the case for large blocks and to say in Bitcoin Cash. And yes, the original vision that Satoshi had for Bitcoin was that it was going to be, the everyday currency. You're going to go buy a cup of coffee with Bitcoins, or Satoshis if it's not the full price. And and so they say that, yeah, this whole idea of, well, no, it's going to be a store of value. It's going to be like gold bars sitting in a vault somewhere in Fort Knox. That's not what the vision was. So I understand that. And then I had Stefan Livera come on to give the other, the small block case and so forth. And say, yeah, you need the Lightning Network and have different layers and blah, blah, blah. So to answer your question, I have not fully come down on, partly because I have to parse the argument, right? Because there was some clash there, and I got to figure out who do I agree with. I understand both sides of it, but certainly BTC right now, the way it's developing, it can't be a day-to-day currency. And partly the whole thing, like if everyone's saying, oh, hodl, well, that a money can't work, right? If nobody ever spends a money, it's not money. Now, in fairness, I think what could happen, and it's not contradictory, is to say, if you expect rapid price appreciation over the next 20 years, but at some point, as Bitcoin penetration, is global, and once it gets to the point where just everybody has some Bitcoin in their portfolio, well, then you're not going to keep getting, 20% annual returns on it, because now there's nowhere else for it to go. And then once it tapered off, then the speculative element would fade away, and then that would kind of free it up. And then the people who are quadrillionaires because they were in early might start unloading some of it, and then maybe, but even at that point, it still wouldn't be, you wouldn't be buying a cup of coffee with it. It would just be more, maybe your family, inheritance would be, oh yeah, we have whatever 2 Bitcoins that have been passed down from our grandpa, and when we die, we're going to pass it down, and we we pledge it as collateral and borrow against it in other chains or other, gold and silver coins. And only very rarely would any individual move something on the layer 1 Bitcoin blockchain. That's certainly, if the block size stays what it is, that's what the future of Bitcoin is.
Right, right. Yeah, I definitely agree, and I'm in that same boat as you, where I'm trying to figure out, the competing arguments around block size. I don't really know exactly where I stand right now, so I'm glad I'm not the only person.
Sorry, let me say one last thing. There is an interesting element, though. If you did have, if you, I'm not sure if you want to call it fractional reserve banking, but yeah, I guess it would have to be for this to work. If you had, um, you know, effectively like fractional reserve banks that used Bitcoin as the underlying base money, then you could have a system where people could be trading claims on the layer 1, and there could be more claims than the underlying thing. You know what I mean? There could be 10 electronic claims pointing to just one Satoshi. And so that would effectively multiply. So in that sense, the price of things measured in Bitcoin would be higher than it otherwise would be. And it would be like, oh, instead of there being 21, the 21 million underlying layer 1 Bitcoin, there's actually like 210 virtual
Mm,
claims on it or whatever. Just like right now, when we think of what's the quantity of dollars, it's not just $100 bill, it's not just currency, and it's not even just reserves at the Fed. It's also the commercial bank checking accounts, which are not legally or economically the same thing. But yet we all kind of think of, oh yeah, if I have $100 in my checking account, I got $100. Even, you know what I mean? So you could imagine a world where people could say, oh yeah, I have 3 Bitcoins in my bank account, but that's not actually, you don't have the private keys for that. It's not on the layer one chain.
Right, right. It totally makes sense. Never even thought about that before. Wow. All right. Well, hey, wrapping up here, I got about 5 minutes left. I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak to the everyday person, like say they're not really an econ nerd, and what would you recommend to them in the next 5 to 10 years, based off the tea leaves that you're reading?
Okay, so you mean like in terms of financial moves
Yeah,
or
yeah. Just,
education? Okay.
well, it could be either, but I'm just trying to figure out like the layperson, average Joe, like what could they do to improve themselves? The whole point of this podcast is self improvement and improving the world. So, what could they do? Either strengthen themselves from a knowledge standpoint or from a financial preparedness standpoint.
Okay, so I would suggest, among other things, trying to develop multiple streams of income. That yes, and then also like a defensive strategy of in terms of like whatever your portfolio is right now, diversify into having, you know, like, so if you're in the US, but wherever you are, like the base money of your country, having, quote, cash in the sense of like in the US, money market funds or something like that, but then also things that are inflation hedges. And so that would be precious metals and Bitcoin and, other cryptocurrencies if you're into that stuff, but certainly some Bitcoin. And again, the point of that is not that any one of those things is a good investment. It's just more, I want people to be very defensive because I think there's going to be a lot of volatility coming up and you want to make sure you don't get wiped out by it. And so this way you're kind of protected no matter, what happens in that respect, that you have a solid core there. And when I say precious metals, I mean things too, like again, for the US, for example, you could get a bunch of uh silver coins, like quarters that were pre 1960. So there's some silver content. And the reason I like just getting some of that and even having like, a month's worth of expenses just in cash in case the banks go down for a while, things like that. And the reason I like to have the silver coins is you could go up to an American, like in an environment where, the banks are down and stuff like that. And you could hold up a 1950 US quarter. And if it's an American, they're going to recognize that, oh yeah, this is the real thing. And then say, go Google it and see what the silver content is. And so you could, that's kind of an easy way to carry around specified weights of silver that anybody who lives in the United States would recognize this is. Whereas if you have like a Krugerrand or something, they might think, well, I don't know what that thing is, So,
Right,
so
right.
that's the function of that for like day-to-day commerce in a Mad Max kind of world where stuff kind of goes down for a few months that, you could barter for stuff like that. I mean, barter's not the right word, but you get what I'm saying. So,
Sure.
so there's that element. But again, I think the flaw a lot of people get into in these kind of questions is they sit there and like imagine they're talking to someone who just has a portfolio and what proportions of this and that. And I think the big thing is develop multiple streams of income because you're going to have to be nimble. And so, yeah, and you don't want to be trying to start that side business when the unemployment rate's 30%. You want to get that up and running now to give some experience and get ahead of it. So anyway, I would just say that ultimately you're going to have to be nimble. And if you have the ability, I would say start, come up with your plan B geographically. Like if you have the means, like get a second passport. And because I think there's going to be a lot of hot spots and whatever, and people may have to move very rapidly. And so just get that going now so you know what you would do and you're not scrambling when, the power's out and there's a 6 month delay for people trying to get a passport.
Wow, apocalyptic. That is certainly a sober analysis, Bob. So thanks for that. We reached the end here, man. So why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Sure. My podcast is bobmurphyshow.com, and on Twitter/X, I am Bob Murphy Econ.
All right. Thank you so much for stopping by today. It was really a pleasure, man. Great talking.
Thanks for having me. Glad to do it.
Yep. Bye.